Hello, and welcome to the fifth and final episode of Sex, Suffrage, and Scandalous Ladies. Thank you for listening. It has been a long journey and a lot of research and a lot of planning, but a really fulfilling process as I wrap up this final episode of my honors project. I hope people have learned something. I certainly have learned a lot more as well through doing research about all of these women. The last episode is going to be about reproductive rights. The first portion is going to be about Margaret Sanger, who is known as the mother of Planned Parenthood. And the second portion is going to be about the activist Loretta Ross and her activism related to intersectional feminism and reproductive justice. So, to start with Margaret Sanger, she was born in Corning, New York in 1879, and she was born to two devout Irish Catholics and was the sixth of 11 children. Not only did Sanger's family suffer from poverty, but her mother, unfortunately, died at age 50, and Margaret Sanger attributes her death to the physical toll 11 pregnancies had on her body. Sanger became a nurse after going to college in 1896, and she completed the program at White Plains Hospital, New York in 1902. In 1910, Margaret Sanger and her husband, William Sanger, moved to New York City at the height of the progressive era. It is reported that the couple was associated with other progressives, Upton Sinclair, Max Eastman, and Emma Goldman. After the death of her mother, Sanger believed that information about family planning and family size could help women escape poverty and have harmful health consequences. Distributing information about birth control, however, was illegal. The infamous Comstock laws were in effect from 1873 until 1965 and prohibited obscene material from being distributed in the mail and in public. Obscene material could be defined as porn and, raunchy material, but also information about contraceptives and birth controls. Sanger, however, made it one of her main goals to repeal the Comstock Act and educate women about birth control. While working as a nurse in New York City, she frequently visited poor immigrant women's homes who had suffered physical ailments from a large number of pregnancies, miscarriages, and botched abortions. In 1914, she launched a newsletter, The Women Rebel, advocating for birth control. As expected, she was charged with violating the Comstock laws and was threatened with jail time. She fled to England to avoid punishment, but had friends distribute her pamphlet in her absence. When she returned from England a year later, she was ready to stand trial, but after public pressure due to the unexpected death of her 5-year-old daughter, the charges were dropped. In 1916, she opened her own clinic in Brooklyn. Not even open for a week, she was arrested and spent 30 days in jail. She appealed, and even though she lost, the courts ruled that women could be prescribed birth control for medical reasons. This loophole allowed Sanger to open another clinic in 1923, staffed with female doctors and social workers to help distribute birth control. This would later go on to become the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Despite her efforts leading to the widespread use of contraceptives, her reputation has been tarnished by her association with the eugenics movement. Eugenics is often generally defined as planned breeding or racial improvement. In the 1920s and 1930s, eugenics was popular among scientists, doctors, and the general public. And a lot of the controversies surrounds Margaret Sanger with a letter that she wrote in 1939 meant to reach Black leaders and ministers in the South. The letter had the intention to debunk rumors and the suspicions about family planning and the clinic she was opening in the South. It was true that she focused her efforts on poor minority women, but because it was these women who had poor access to mainstream health care, and they were especially vulnerable to the impacts of unplanned pregnancies. In 1966, the year of Margaret Sanger's death, Martin Luther King Jr. stated in her support, "There is a striking kinship between our movement and Margaret Sanger's early efforts," he said. Margaret Sanger has come to commit what was then called a crime in order to enrich humanity, and today we honor her courage and vision. In 1921, she did write a letter claiming, "The most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the overfertility of the mentally and physically defective." This quote does not read along the lines of the eugenics movement. Or it does read along the lines of the eugenics movie. My bad. Although misinformed, she did normalize the widespread of contraceptives throughout the country. However, Planned Parenthood of the greater New York area removed her name from the Manhattan clinic because of her ties to the eugenics movement. So the clinic stated, The removal of Margaret Sanger's name from our building is both a necessary and overdue step to reckon with our legacy and acknowledge Planned Parenthood's contributions to historical reproductive harm within communities of color, Karen Seltzer, the chair of the New York Affiliates Board, said in a statement. They also argue Planned Parenthood, like many other organizations that have existed for a century or more, is reckoning with our history and working to address historical inequities and better serve patients and our mission, which was stated by Melian Russell-Newman, a spokeswoman for the group. Despite the controversy, it is largely due to Margaret Sanger's efforts that doctors were allowed to prescribe birth control in 1936. The pill was also approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. Margaret Sanger passed away in 1966 at 86 years old. Moving into the next activist I wanted to talk about, I thought it would be important to talk about someone who has carried Margaret Sanger's torch in a sense by advocating for reproductive rights, but also includes all women in their activism. Loretta Ross is a Black woman with many years of activism under her belt and emphasizes the needs of women in color in her campaigns. I actually have had the pleasure of hearing Loretta Ross speak to the URI community twice while I have been an undergraduate here. She attended Howard University in 1970 and began her activism at a demonstration and was tear-gassed. While in Washington, D.C., she also advocated against racism and gentrification. On her website, Loretta Ross claims that she first joined the feminist movement in 1978 by working at the first rape crisis center in the country. This is where she first learned about how to combat women's human rights, reproductive justice, white supremacy, and women of color organizing. She was the first Black woman to direct a rape crisis center. Loretta Ross also launched the Women of Color program for the National Organization of Women in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, she worked with researchers on how to work against the KKK and white supremacy. In 2004, she was the national co-director of the March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C., which at the time was the largest protest in history with over 115 million participants. She has also helped co-write and author 4 books. She is also a survivor of rape and bore a child that was the result of incest. She was also a victim of forced sterilization at 23 years old. Among all her works for social justice, she developed the organization's Sister Song in 1997 to help women and women of color access reproductive justice. Sister Song is the 5th and longest-lived coalition of women in color to fight for reproductive justice. This organization claims that its work produces a special benefit by including intersectionality in its work because reproductive issues for women are large and varied. Instead of focusing on the means, Sister Song focuses on the ends. Instead of debates about abortion and birth control that sometimes reduce the impacts placed on the overall everyday lives of women and girls, they focus on better lives for women, sustainable communities, and healthier families. Sister Song believes it's important to fight for 1, the right to have a child, 2, the right not to have a child, and 3, the right to parent the children we have. The focus on reproductive justice relies on the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, and economic well-being of women and girls. Reproductive justice also addresses the roots of reproductive inequity, such as access to education and health care. The organization claims we have to address the inequity of opportunities we are given to control our reproductive health and our reproductive destiny. In the article, Understanding Reproductive Justice, Transforming the Pro-Choice Movement, Loretta Ross writes, by shifting the focus to reproductive oppression, the control and exploitation of women, girls, and individuals through our bodies, sexuality, labor, and reproduction, rather than a narrow focus on protecting the legal right to abortion, we're developing a more inclusive vision of how to build a new movement. Sister Song also emphasizes the importance of grassroots organizing and their advocacy to include local leaders and provide the best outcomes for communities. They also emphasize that sex is rarely talked about when talking about reproductive rights and are trying to shift the framework. In a TED Talk in 2021, Loretta Ross discusses the harmful impacts of cancel culture. She states, when you ask people to give up hate, you have to be there for them when they do. When you try to cancel someone, you are inviting them to a fight, not a conversation. Instead of calling people out, we need to call them in, which I think emphasizes the goal of my project very well, which is one of the reasons I chose to end my passion project with this episode. It is tough to learn about all the social injustices and even more difficult to think about what we have to do with them. As Loretta Ross would advise, it's not what we do, but how we do it. Loretta Ross claims that usually the people you disagree with are just as complicated as you. She advises to look at that person right in the eye, cock your head to the side, and say, "Beg your pardon," and most of the time they will walk back their words. She emphasizes that forgiveness is freedom. It's freedom from regret, anger, and from hatred. You have to let other people know that they have options about who they want to be, but you also shouldn't let people's bigotry go unchallenged. She argues that when we fight for justice, all we risk is losing is our pain. She finishes her talk by explaining, fighting hate should be fun. It's being a hater that sucks. Today, Loretta Ross is 68 years old, and one of the major things left on her bucket list is to see Serena and Venus Williams play tennis live. She is a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. She has taught at several universities, but currently teaches at Smith College in Western Massachusetts. Thank you for listening to my last episode of Sex, Suffrage, and Scandalous Ladies for my honors project here at URI. I hope you learned something new about these two women who are both pioneers in their activism, despite some of Margaret Sanger's flaws. Certainly, this podcast has been very special to me as I finished my college career. Activists are typically spoken of as these extraordinary heroes, but they can be everyday people trying to make a difference in their community and the world at large. Stories of this nature are crucial because they offer more perspectives and amplification, but they also inspire individuals that they can be the change they want to see. To close, activism is something we are all capable of, and in times of recent turmoil, it's crucial to remember that we can all make a difference, no matter how big or how small. So, finally, thank you for listening.